everyone. Welcome to our Flood Help NY Flood Insurance webinar. My name is Rabia Altabani, and I'm a program associate here at the Center for New York City Neighborhoods. Just a few announcements before we get started. You might have noticed as you came in that the webinar is being recorded tonight. And in regards to any questions, we will be taking questions at the end of this presentation, or you can also type them down in the chat and we'll go over those questions as well as at the end of the webinar. Next slide, please. So let's get started. Again, thank you all for joining us tonight. I'd like to first introduce the partners who are bringing you this critical content that we have. First, the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, the Center for New York City Neighborhoods, and NHS Brooklyn. Next slide, please. The Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice works to ensure that New York City is prepared to withstand and emerge stronger from the impacts of climate change, mitigate its greenhouse gas emissions, and address needed remediation and environmental coordination efforts from an equity and public health perspective. Next slide, please. The Center is one of the largest homeowner services organizations in New York City. We were founded in 2008 in response to the foreclosure crisis and have since expanded to support and expand affordable homeownership across New York State. All of our services are free to homeowners. Folks can reach us online or by calling 311 and asking for help with homeowner issues. Next slide, please. We also have with us tonight NHS Brooklyn. NHS Brooklyn creates and preserves affordable housing by providing opportunities for homeownership education, financial assistance, and community leadership. Next slide, please. FloodHelpNY.org is a platform that engages and informs New York City homeowners about how to protect their home and finances from flooding that is expected to worsen with rising sea levels caused by climate change. Next slide. On the FloodHelpNY.org website, you can look up your property on the flood zone map, learn about flood insurance, and how to lower your premium through retrofits. You'll find small business resources and resources on climate change, stormwater flooding, and hurricanes. Now I will hand it over to Theodora Macris, who is also from the center and who's going to give us an in-depth look into flood insurance. Theodora, it's all yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Rabia. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Theodora, and I'm a policy and research associate at the Center for New York City Neighborhoods. Thanks for joining this event tonight. We'll be discussing FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program, also known as the NFIP. We'll also be discussing Risk Rating 2.0, the newest iteration of FEMA's flood risk calculation. This presentation aims to give you a high-level overview of everything you need to know to manage your flood risk and flood insurance. And besides Rabia, I'm joined tonight by Beth Malone from Neighborhood Housing Services of Brooklyn. Beth is a housing counselor who works specifically on flood insurance education and training. She's here to answer your questions at the end of today's webinar. You can also, as Rabia said, put your questions in the chat during the presentation. Thanks again for joining us. Next slide, please. Here's an overview of what we'll be covering tonight in our presentation, including the benefits of flood insurance, the National Flood Insurance Program, flood insurance rate maps, flood insurance coverage, pay renewals and lapses in coverage, Risk Rating 2.0, local resources for you, and finally, Q&A. Next slide, please. And before we begin, we want to once again poll those of you in the audience to gauge your understanding of flood insurance. So please use the functions on your screen to answer the question. And if you can't for any reason, please put your answers to the questions in the chat. We'll give folks a few minutes to answer before we look over the results. Okay, the results are in. Seems like folks, some have a fair amount of knowledge and others don't, which is great. That's why we're here tonight. So thanks for participating, and we can get started on the material. So next slide, please. So why are we here today? We're here to talk about flood risk and flood insurance because as New Yorkers, we know just how destructive flooding is, both in our homes and in our communities. And in New York City, we're very vulnerable to coastal floods and severe rainfall flooding due to our position on the coast. And because our city is full of concrete, it makes drawing water into the earth very difficult. The center, through FloodHelpNY.org, works with the City of New York, including the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, to conduct outreach and education on the importance of flood insurance. And we hope today's event serves as a reminder for why it's important to learn about your flood risk and determine if a flood insurance policy is necessary to keep you, your loved ones, and your home safe. Next slide, please. So what is the NFIP? The National Flood Insurance Program, or the NFIP, is overseen by FEMA and provides financial assistance to property owners, renters, and businesses. Changes to the NFIP largely require congressional reform. Communities covered by the NFIP have agreed to uphold building code standards and other flood management practices to enforce regulations to help mitigate the effects of flooding on new and improved structures. Flood insurance is not included in homeowners insurance and needs to be purchased separately for you to have coverage. Flood insurance is federally required for some properties, including those with a federally backed mortgage or those that have received financial disaster assistance. An NFIP policy is the only way to ensure that your property is protected from flood damage. Next slide, please. So in addition to what was just mentioned, here are a few other things you should know about the NFIP. Every building has a flood zone. Buildings in high-risk flood zones may be required to buy flood insurance. Flood insurance is available for any zone, not just high-risk ones, which is why it's important to understand your flood risk because you might need flood insurance and not know it. Claims could be filed without a federal declaration of disaster. For example, Hurricanes Sandy and Ida are examples of federal declarations of disaster, but they can also be hyper-local floods that cover just a few neighborhoods, not necessarily floods that cover all of New York City. Next slide, please. What is a flood? This may seem obvious, but FEMA does define flooding very specifically. In this case, flooding is defined as rising tides or moving groundwater, flooding from water main breaks or rainstorms, a partial or complete inundation of 2 or more acres of normally dry land, or of 2 or more properties. It's important to note once again that there are no flood protections in any standard property policy. Your homeowner's insurance will not cover flood damage in the event of a flood. Next slide, please. Flood insurance rate maps or firms map the special flood hazard areas and base elevations for participating communities in the NFIP. And mapping is a process. And as you can see by the slide, FIRM has gone through a couple of updates in New York City since they were first introduced. And these maps are in the process of being updated and are anticipated to be finalized as soon as 2025. Next slide, please. As far as coverage, it's important to understand exactly what is and isn't covered under your flood insurance policy. The maximum coverage for your home is $250,000. This may include heat and hot water systems, appliances, carpeting, and foundation walls. The maximum coverage for the contents in your home is $100,000. This may include personal property like clothing or furniture, window air conditioners, and washer dryers. Contents that are excluded from coverage include damage sustained in basements, decks, patios, and fences, and cars and their parts. One thing to note is that deductibles vary, so it's important to read through your policy to make sure you know exactly what your deductible is. It's also important to note that only personal property is covered for renters. Next slide, please. Updating your renewal. So it's important to always update your renewal on time. All policies take 30 days to go into effect, so it's important to get coverage as soon as possible to ensure your home is protected in the event of a flood. So do not wait until after it floods to consider having insurance. If payment is received outside of that 30-day grace period, any previously applied subsidies will be eliminated. Additionally, the full risk premium will be required, meaning you will not get the benefit of the 18% cap. So to stay on track with payments and maintain any subsidies you may have, read over your policy to learn when your renewal is due. Next slide, please. So what's Risk Rating 2.0? FEMA introduced Risk Rating 2.0 in October 2021, which is now the NFIP's current rating structure. So rather than using flood maps to determine your flood risk and by extension, your flood insurance premium, this has resulted in premium changes for many people nationwide. Some have seen their rates decrease and others may experience an increase. FEMA is required to cap increases at 18% per year. So starting back in October of 2021, Risk Rating 2.0 was used in all new policies. As of April of 2022, if you renewed your policy, these new rates were applied. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, Risk Rating 2.0 uses several variables to more accurately calculate your flood risk and the price you pay. These variables include the type of water sources, the distance from the coast or another flood source, flood frequency, flood type, property characteristics, and the property's prior flood losses. Next slide, please. Okay, so I know we just went through a lot of new information. There are some things that aren't changing under Risk Rating 2.0. Your annual rate increase will not exceed 18%. If you have a mandatory flood insurance requirement now, that won't change. And any previously applied discounts on the former homeowner's flood insurance policy can be transferred to you if you purchase the home. Next slide, please. So now that we went through some of this info, we want to show you a brief video just to recap it all.
Flooding is the most costly and the most common disaster risk to the majority of American communities. Nearly every disaster involves flooding of some sort. New York City has 520 miles of total coastline and has more residents living in high-risk flood zones than any other city in the country. Unfortunately, mandatory flood insurance zones are not accurate predictors of your flood risk. You may be at risk even if you live outside the flood zone. Homeowners insurance and flood insurance are different and must be purchased separately. Unlike homeowners insurance, flood insurance covers damage caused by rising water, even if there is not a major disaster event. And even if there is a major disaster and you don't have flood insurance, you will have to rely on government assistance. So let's talk numbers. After Hurricane Harvey, homeowners without insurance received an average FEMA assistance award of $4,500. But the average home repair costs were nearly $50,000, more than 10 times the average FEMA payout. However, those with flood insurance received on average more than $100,000. The good news? Flood insurance is more affordable than you may think. Many policies can be purchased for as little as $3 per day. Flood insurance coverage is the most effective way to mitigate flood risk and ensure your family and home are protected. Visit FloodHelpNY.org to learn what your home's flood risk is and how to get the coverage you may need.
Thanks for watching. I hope that was informative. Please go to FloodHelpNY.org for more flood insurance resources. You can use the interactive map to search for your property and learn your flood risk. You can learn how your business can plan for flooding and explore flood mitigation options and ways to lower your insurance premium. Next slide, please. For more information on flood risk and flood insurance, contact FEMA directly with any questions you may have. and sign up for Notify NYC on your smartphone to receive emergency service alerts, including real-time flood warnings. Next slide, please. Thanks very much for joining tonight's webinar. Please send any additional questions you have to the emails you see on your screen. We also encourage you to sign up for Flood Help New York's newsletter for these consistent updates. And thank you so much for joining us. We'll leave the slide up just in case anyone needs to jot down those emails, but thanks again for joining.